Okay, let's dive into something that, well, it sounds like a complete contradiction when you first hear it. Nomadic empires.
Right. Nomads, you picture people always on the move,
Yeah.
following herds, seasons.
Exactly. And then empires, you think huge, settled lands, big administrations, fixed capitals, all that stuff.
So how do those two concepts even fit together? How can people who are constantly moving build these um, massive, stable empires that stretch across continents?
It just doesn't seem to line up with our usual picture of how empires work, does it?
Not really. It definitely challenges that conventional idea we have about, state building and what an empire looks like. We're so used to thinking about monumental buildings, complex bureaucracies, populations tied to farmland.
Yeah.
The idea of a truly nomadic group pulling off something on that imperial scale, well, it makes you stop and rethink those basic assumptions.
Absolutely. And today, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. We're focusing on probably the most famous example ever, the Mongols, yeah, and of course the incredible story of Genghis Khan.
Yeah, we've got this really great text to guide us through it. It takes us right from their beginnings on the Central Asian steppes.
Windswept is probably the word.
Definitely. It covers their, explosive rise, the sheer scale of their conquests, which is just staggering how they organized everything, which was unique, and then the legacy they left, which is, well, complicated.
Very complicated. So our mission here really is to pull out the core insights from this material.
Yeah.
We want to go beyond just listing facts and dates.
Right. We want to get at what made the whole Mongol phenomenon possible. Why did it happen like that? What are those surprising details in the sources that tell us about a different way of building and running a huge empire?
It's about getting you, the listener, up to speed quickly but properly on what made the Mongols so unique and why their impact on, well, pretty much all of Eurasia was so massive.
And just to set the scene properly, geography matters here. We're talking about those vast, often pretty harsh lands of Central Asia. This was the homeland for loads of nomadic groups, way before the Mongols became dominant. You had Bedouin peoples further south, various Turkic groups, and then the Mongol tribes themselves.
And it's great contrast, isn't it? We've looked before at how settled states formed in places like the Central Islamic lands or the Arabian Peninsula. This is, well, it's a totally different way of creating power and expanding.
It really is. And right away, the text jumps into that central tension. We mentioned the definition of nomadic empires.
Oh, yeah. How does it define nomads?
Pretty simply, actually. Wanderers, organized usually in family groups or clans, with what the text calls a rudimentary political structure.
Rudimentary. Sounds a bit basic, maybe even primitive compared to settled kingdoms.
That's the implication, perhaps. And then you contrast that with empire. The source frames that as needing, immense territory, and usually an elaborate, fixed administrative system to keep it all running.
Okay, so wanderers with basic structures versus huge territories needing complex management. Seems incompatible.
Exactly. But the source immediately flags that maybe these definitions, especially the rudimentary bit about nomads, might be too narrow. Maybe they even carry a bit of historical prejudice from the people who wrote the sources.
Ah, okay. So the people writing about them maybe didn't quite get it or had their own biases?
Could be. It forces us to ask that core question. How did people whose whole life was about movement, seemingly based on simple kinship, managed to create something as mind-bogglingly huge and complex as the Mongol Empire?
And what's the key insight the text offers on that? How do they do it?
Well, the really fascinating idea is that they didn't just conquer settled peoples and then clumsily try to impose their old steppe customs onto, say, cities and farms. They adapted. That seems to be the crucial word.
Adaptation. How so?
They took their existing ways, their social organization, how they structured loyalty, their military systems, and they modified them. They reshaped these traditions to build a system that could actually work across those enormous distances, from China all the way to Eastern Europe. And critically, a system that could somehow manage and integrate incredibly diverse peoples, different economies, different religions. It wasn't just conquest. It was this pretty sophisticated process of tweaking their own nomadic structure to fit the job of ruling a settled world.
That's a much more nuanced picture than just, barbarians at the gates.
Absolutely. But that brings us straight to a really big problem when you study nomads, especially the Mongols. The sources. Where do we get our information?
Right. Who wrote this stuff down?
The text makes it really clear. People living out on the steppe generally didn't produce much written literature themselves. Their history, their stories, it was mostly oral tradition.
So we're hearing about them from other people.
Mostly, yes. The vast majority of what we know comes from the literate folks in the settled societies they encounter, and often the ones they conquered. Chinese scholars, Persian historians, European travelers.
And that immediately raises, a big red flag, doesn't it? You're getting the story mainly from the perspective of people who were invaded, often terrified, maybe even saw their cities destroyed by the Mongols.
Precisely. That perspective is crucial. And this is where the source gets into the historical baggage tied to the words used to describe nomads, like the word barbarian.
Ah, yeah. Where does that actually come from?
It starts with the ancient Greeks, barbaros. It originally just meant someone who didn't speak Greek. Their language sounded like, nonsense syllables, bar, bar, bar.
Just noise, basically.
Yeah.
Gibberish.
Pretty much. But that initial meaning, which was more about language than anything else, it shifted. Pretty quickly, in Greek writing and then especially Roman writing, barbarians started to take on really negative meanings.
Like what?
Uncivilized, cruel, undisciplined, lacking self-control. And, really importantly for this discussion, politically incapable. The idea was that barbarians were inherently unable to govern themselves properly or build complex states.
And the Romans used this label for lots of groups they ran into, right? Germans, Celts, Huns.
They did, Goths too. And the source makes a really strong point here. Whenever a group got labeled barbarian in these traditional histories, that term never meant something positive. Not once.
Okay, so that's baked into the historical language itself.
It is, and that's absolutely critical. When we read accounts of the Mongols written by people from settled cultures, Chinese, Persian, European, whatever, we have to realize they were often looking at the Mongols through this lens, this centuries-old prejudice against nomadic peoples, seeing them as inherently chaotic, destructive, maybe not capable of sophisticated organization.
So if the main written sources are filtered through that kind of bias and the Mongols themselves didn't write much down, how do historians even begin to piece together a picture that gets closer to what the Mongols were really like?
It's a huge challenge. The source points to a few key pathways, though. Russian scholars, for instance, especially back in the Tsarist and early Soviet times, they did some pioneering work.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. How was their perspectives different?
Well, figures like Vasily Vladimirovich Bartold, his work was massive, like 9 volumes. They often approached the Mongols with perhaps a bit less of that intense fear and demonization you sometimes see in Western European accounts. They focused on things like Mongol language, their social structures, religion, culture, often giving a more, let's say, nuanced view.
But even that wasn't straightforward.
No, the text mentions that even Bartold's work hit problems. It got curtailed by Soviet censorship in the 1930s, which just goes to show even academic work isn't totally separate from the political climate it's created in.
Right. Now, politics always finds a way in. Okay, so the Russians offered one angle. What about sources from closer to the action, within the regions the Mongols conquered?
Yeah, Persian and Arab chroniclers are absolutely vital here. Because the Mongols set up huge states, these khanates, in Persia and Central Asia, they actually employed local literate people, officials, historians.
So people from those cultures were working for the Mongols.
Exactly. And writing about them. People like Giovanni, a Persian historian in the mid-13th century, and especially Rashid-ud-din. He was a really high-ranking official, the wazir at the Ilkhanid court, that's the Mongol state in Persia in the early 14th century. His work is considered incredibly valuable.
What was so special about his work?
He wrote this massive history called the Jami al-Tawarik, the collection of chronicles. And what's amazing is that Rashid-ud-din, writing under Mongol patronage, deliberately tried to include Mongol and Turkic oral traditions alongside sources from China and India. He was aiming for a kind of universal history.
Wow, that sounds incredibly ambitious for the time.
It really was. It shows how cosmopolitan that Ilkhanid court could be. Although, kind of ironically, the text points out that Rashid-ud-din himself was later executed by the very Mongol ruler he served.
Ouch. So even being the official historian didn't guarantee your safety.
Apparently not. Life could be pretty precarious, even at the top in that empire.
Okay, so Persian and Arab sources are key.
Oh.
What about Europeans? Marco Polo always comes up.
He does. And European travelers like Polo definitely went to the Mongol lands, and their stories became famous, hugely influential back in Europe. But the source adds a note of caution. Even with someone like Marco Polo, if you compare his account carefully with Mongol or Turkic terms and concepts from other sources, you sometimes find, well, discrepancies. Things don't quite match up, It just highlights again how difficult it was to accurately understand and translate things across such massive cultural and language
It's
barriers.
like a game of telephone across continents.
Kinda, yeah. And that brings us to the question, is there anything written from the Mongol perspective itself? Did they leave any written record?
Yeah, is there a Mongol voice in all this?
There is one text that's absolutely crucial. It's called The Secret History of the Mongols, or Mongol Unuche to be Ayan in Mongolian.
The Secret History. Sounds intriguing.
It is. It's seen as the earliest narrative history that really focuses on Genghis Khan and how the empire started. It was written in Mongolian, probably for the Mongol rulers themselves, so it gives us priceless insights into how they saw events, their values, their leaders.
But there's a catch, I assume.
There is. The source points out it's written in a really complex old form of Mongolian, so interpreting it accurately is apparently quite difficult even for specialists today.
So you're juggling all these different sources, accounts in Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Mongolian, Russian, Italian, Latin, French, German. Just reading them all is a massive task.
It is. And just translating the words is only the start. The real challenge, like the source says, is getting the concepts right. What did a certain phrase mean in 13th century Persian court language compared to 13th century steppe Mongolian?
Right, the nuances.
Exactly. How does the bias of a Chinese official historian differ from the bias of, say, an Egyptian Mamluk chronicler whose side actually defeated the Mongols later on? Understanding all those layers, all those perspectives is key if you want to get a balanced picture and move beyond that simple barbarian stereotype.
It sounds incredibly complex, like a giant historical puzzle, but fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears. From the challenges of studying them, let's get to the man himself. The one who somehow pulled all these nomadic groups together and kicked this whole thing off. The man who became Genghis Khan.
Right. His birth name was Temujin.
Temujin?
Yeah. Born around 1162 near the Onan River, which is in modern-day Mongolia. His father, Yasuge, was a chief of the Kiat group, part of the larger Mongol people. But his early life was really tough, marked by a lot of insecurity.
Things went wrong early on.
Very early. A huge turning point was his father being murdered when Temujin was still just a kid. And the consequences were immediate and brutal.
What?
His father's followers basically just scattered. They abandoned Temujin, his mother, his siblings, left him completely destitute out on the steppe.
Wow, so the family was just left to fend for themselves.
Pretty much. They fell into extreme poverty, had to survive by hunting small animals, gathering roots. Imagine the guy who would later conquer half the known world started out struggling just to eat.
That's an unbelievable origin story. Just pure survival.
Absolutely. And the source mentions that this period of hardship even included him being captured by rivals and held as a slave for a time, sometime in the 1160s or 70s.
Held in slavery. The future great Khan.
Yeah. Abandoned, impoverished, and then enslaved. It's quite the beginning.
So how did he possibly climb out of that?
Well, escaping from slavery was obviously a huge step. It showed his, determination and resourcefulness even then. But another really key event happened after that. His young wife, Borte, was kidnapped by a rival tribe.
Okay, another crisis.
Yes, but this one actually became a catalyst. To get her back, Temujin had to go and seek help from more powerful figures on the steppe. This forced him into making alliances and taking his first real military actions.
So a personal quest turns into political maneuvering and warfare.
In essence, yes. And the text stresses how important the alliances he built during these early years were. This is roughly the 1180s, 1190s.
Who were his key allies then?
Two were highlighted. First, Jamuga, who became his and Das's the blood brother. That was a really sacred bond on the steppe. And second, Togrul, also known as Ong Khan, who was the powerful ruler of another large group, the Karyots.
Okay, so he found powerful friends.
He did. These alliances gave him the backing, the warriors, the legitimacy he needed to start building his own power base. But, as often happens,
Those alliances didn't last forever.
no. As Temujin got stronger, rivalry started to emerge. The source explains that his road to unifying all the Mongol tribes was basically a series of conflicts where he had to overcome powerful rivals.
Who did he have to fight?
Other big tribal groups like the Tatars, the Naimans, eventually the Karyots, including his former ally, Ong Khan. And in a really dramatic turn, he ultimately fought and defeated his own blood brother, Jamuga.
Wow, even his blood brother.
Yeah. It was a period of pretty ruthless struggle for dominance, using alliances when useful and warfare when necessary. This whole period leading up to 1206 was about consolidating power.
And 1206 is the big year. the turning point.
It's the pivotal moment. In
Mm.
1206, there was a huge meeting, a grand assembly called a Kriltai. And at this assembly, Temujin was formally acclaimed as Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan, what does that title actually mean?
Usually translated as something like universal ruler or maybe oceanic ruler, it signified he was now the supreme leader, the undisputed ruler of all the Mongols.
And this wasn't just a fancy title. It meant real change.
Oh, absolutely. The source says that right after getting this title, Genghis Khan totally reorganized the Mongol people. He took the old tribal structures and basically dismantled them, reorganizing everyone into a new, highly disciplined military force.
How did he do that?
Based on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. It broke down those old clan loyalties and created a unified army that answered directly to him. This reorganization, stemming from that 1206 Kriltai, was the stroke of genius that really created the Mongol war machine, ready for the massive campaigns that were about to begin.
Okay, so Mongols unified, army reorganized under Genghis Khan. The machine is built. Where does he point it first?
The initial target, starting around 1205, even before the big proclamation, were the settled, wealthy neighbors right next door, particularly North China.
Makes sense. Close and rich.
Exactly. They went after the Zhige kingdom first, and then the powerful Jin dynasty. They subjugated the Xia, won major victories against the Jin, even captured their capital around 1215. But then, around 1218, there's a major shift in focus noted in the source.
They looked west instead, toward Central Asia.
That's right. Their attention swung dramatically towards the huge Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled Persia and a lot of Central Asia. And the trigger for this war was, well, a massive diplomatic blunder by the Khwarezmian ruler.
What did he do?
He executed Mongol envoys that Genghis Khan had sent, a huge insult and a fatal mistake. The source describes Genghis Khan unleashing his fury in response. This kicked off absolutely devastating campaigns from 1219 to 1221.
And the level of destruction in Central Asia during those few years? It's infamous.
It's hard to even grasp. The text just lists city after city that fell and faced utter devastation. Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, Balkh, Gurganj, Merv, Nishapur, Herat. These were major centers of civilization.
Was destruction the only option?
The pattern seemed to be, if a city resisted, it faced annihilation. If it surrendered quickly, it might be spared the worst destruction, but it would still be looted and brought under Mongol control. It was warfare that used terror as a deliberate tactic to break the enemy's will to resist.
And that leads us to those shocking numbers mentioned in the text, the estimated death tolls.
Yeah, they are truly staggering. The source gives figures like 1.6 million people allegedly killed in Herat in 1222, 1.2 million in Nishapur. Later on, under his grandson Hulagu, the estimate for Baghdad in 1258 is 800,000.
These numbers are almost inconceivable for medieval cities. That's like wiping out the population of major European centers at the time.
It is. And the text even includes figures for smaller towns. 40,000 in Fasa, 70,000 in Baihak, another 70,000 in the Kuistan area. And that account from the chronicler Juvani about Merv, it's particularly grim.
What did he say?
He claimed 1.3 million were killed there, and that the counting of the dead took 13 days, implying they were somehow tallying 100,000 bodies a day.
Which forces you, like the text suggests, to ask, can these numbers possibly be accurate? How would anyone even count that many dead bodies back then?
It's almost certain they aren't precise statistical counts. Counting millions, especially in the chaos after a siege and massacre with medieval methods, logistically impossible.
So where do these huge numbers come from? Are they just made up?
Probably not just made up out of thin air. They likely represent estimates, maybe based on the city's supposed original population combined with the sheer horror of what observers saw. But more importantly, these huge figures, even if exaggerated, they serve a purpose in the chronicles.
What purpose?
They convey the scale of the terror. They communicate the magnitude of the destruction from the perspective of those who suffered it. They function almost as, well, anti-Mongol propaganda in a way, emphasizing their brutality. So we shouldn't take them as exact data, but they're incredibly valuable as evidence of the perception of the violence, the psychological shockwave the Mongols created. They tell us about the trauma inflicted.
So the numbers themselves are part of the story of the fear they generated. Okay. Genghis Khan himself dies in 1227, but the expansion doesn't stop there.
Not at all. It keeps going really in two big waves after his death, led by his sons and grandsons. The first phase, roughly 1236 to 1242, was spearheaded by the descendants of Jochi, his eldest son. This lineage became known as the Golden Horde.
And they went west.
They did, pushed deep into the Russian steppes, conquered the Kievan-Rus' state, raided Poland, Hungary. Batu Khan's campaigns between 1236 and 1241 were particularly brutal and reached right to the edges of Central Europe, with Mongol armies appearing outside Vienna.
Right up to the doorstep of Western Europe.
Pretty much. Then the second big phase of expansion, this is more like 1255 to 1300, was led by the descendants of Tului, Genghis Khan's youngest son. This line included famous names like Monkey, Hulagu, and Kublai Khan.
And where they focus?
They finished the conquest of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty there under Kublai Khan, and they also pushed southwest, conquering the rest of Persia, Iraq, and Syria. A huge moment in this phase was Hulagu capturing Baghdad in 1258.
The end of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Exactly. A massive event in the Islamic world, ending a dynasty that had lasted for 500 years.
It's just an incredible amount of territory conquered in just a few decades after Genghis Khan's death. What finally stopped them? Why didn't they just keep going?
The source points to two main sets of reasons for why the expansion eventually slowed and stopped. The first one, and maybe the most important internally, was politics within the Mongol royal family itself.
Infighting.
Pretty much. Remember, Genghis Khan had divided the empire, or at least the responsibility for different regions and peoples, among his four main sons' families, the lineages of Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. These were the Ulus.
Right.
Well, after he died, competition for the top job, the Great Khan title, and disputes over land and resources between these different branches just got fiercer and fiercer.
So they started fighting each other instead of conquering others.
Exactly. There was a major war between the Golden Horde, the Jochids in the west, and the Ilkhanate, the Toluids in Persia during the 1260s. That was right when the Ilkhans were trying to push further into Syria and Egypt. These internal conflicts soaked up huge amounts of military power and political focus. The source presents this internal division as the first key reason the expansion hit its limits.
So internal problems were maybe more decisive than outside enemies initially.
Arguably, yes, in terms of stopping the coordinated, large-scale offensive push. But external factors were definitely important too, and they're the second reason the source gives.
Like what?
Well, simple geography sometimes played a role trying to campaign effectively in very dense forests or high mountains, or maybe environments like Southeast Asia was difficult. But crucially, they eventually ran into strong, organized states that could effectively resist them.
They weren't invincible forever.
No. And the most famous example mentioned is the Mamluk Sultanate, based in Egypt. They handed the Mongol Ilkhans a major defeat at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1260.
Ain Jalut, that was a big deal.
A huge deal. It effectively stopped the Mongol advance southwest into the core lands of the Islamic world, towards Egypt and North Africa. It proved they could be beaten in a pitched battle by a well-prepared, determined enemy.
Okay, so internal divisions and external resistance eventually checked them. But going back to that period of incredible success, what made their military so effective in the first place? What were the keys to the war machine?
Several things come together, according to the source. First, just their incredible skill as horsemen. They grew up on the steppe, practically lived in the saddle.
Masters of cavalry warfare.
Absolutely. And combined with that was their mastery of the composite bow. It was incredibly powerful, accurate, and they could use it effectively while riding at high speed. This allowed for amazing mobility. They could cover huge distances quickly, launch surprise attacks, use tactics like feigned retreats to draw enemies into traps.
They conquered huge fortified cities, too. Bows and horses aren't enough for that, are they?
No, and this is where that adaptation we talked about is so clear again. Genghis Khan and his successors quickly realized they needed siege warfare capabilities.
So they learned how to take down walls.
They did, and the source emphasizes how pragmatic they were. They actively recruited or captured engineers from the societies they conquered from China, from Persia, wherever they found expertise.
Right.
These engineers built and operated sophisticated siege engines for them.
Like catapults and things.
Yeah, exactly. Catapults, huge counterweight trebuchets, even weapons using things like naphtha, basically flammable oil for incendiary attacks. It shows they weren't just sticking to their traditional steppe tactics, they were absorbing and integrating the best technology they encountered, making them deadly against both armies in the field and cities behind high walls. They also mastered things like coordinating large troop movements using signals, ensuring different parts of the army worked together effectively.
Okay, so they conquered this enormous, incredibly diverse area. How do they even begin to organize it? How does a group with nomadic roots start governing all these settled farmers and city dwellers, often vastly outnumbering the Mongols themselves?
That's maybe the most complex part of the story. That initial reorganization back in 1206, based on the decimal system, that was key for military and social cohesion among the Mongols and their allies. Remember, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 Arbans, Jagans, Mingans, Tumans.
The number-based structure.
Right. And the crucial thing, socially and politically, was that this deliberately cut across old tribal lines. People from different clans got mixed into these new units. Their main loyalty wasn't supposed to be to their old tribe anymore, but upwards to their commanders, and ultimately to the Great Khan and the Empire.
Was this new structure purely Mongol?
No, and the source makes a point of this. Even very early on, the Mongol armies included fighters and whole groups from peoples they'd conquered or allied with. Various Turkic peoples like the Uyghurs, the Karyots, they were integrated well before the really huge conquests began. So the empire's military corps was already diverse from the start.
And how did Genghis Khan ensure loyalty within this new structure, especially at the top?
Personal loyalty was absolutely central, building on steppe traditions. He had his close personal followers, the Noker. He had his blood brothers, the Onda. And he basically created a new ruling class, an aristocracy where rank and favor, the Knockers, depended more on proven loyalty and service to him than just on old noble bloodlines.
So merit and loyalty over birth, to some extent?
To a significant extent, especially in the early days. It tied the leadership directly to him.
Okay, that's the internal organization. But how did they manage the actual conquered lands? Did they divide them up?
Yes, that's where the Ula system comes in again. Genghis Khan assigned vast regions, or rather the peoples and pastures within those regions, to his four main sons' lineages. Jochi got the west, Chagatai got Central Asia, Ogadai got areas near Mongolia, Tului got the Mongol heartland itself, plus future conquests in the east and south.
But you said these weren't like fixed countries at first.
Right. The source clarifies they were initially more like assignments of people and the territories they used, not neat geographical states with defined borders. It was about who ruled which groups and where they could graze their herds.
And this system, meant to share power, ended up causing problems later.
It did. While it might have seemed a practical way to manage things initially, giving each son's family a state and responsibilities, it ultimately set the stage for those intense rivalries and succession wars after Genghis Khan was gone. Over time, these ulas did harden into more distinct, often competing khanates: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China.
So within these different khanates, how did the Mongol rulers actually govern the millions of farmers and city people they now controlled? Their own background was herding animals on the steppe.
And that's where their pragmatism really shines. They knew they didn't have the experience to run complex agricultural economies or manage big cities with sophisticated bureaucracies. So what did they do?
They used local experts.
Exactly. The source highlights that they heavily relied on administrators drawn from the conquered societies. In North China, they used experienced Chinese officials familiar with the old Jin dynasty systems. In Persia and Iraq, they employed skilled Persian and Arab bureaucrats who knew how Islamic administration and finance worked.
Makes sense. Use the people who already know how to do the job.
It was highly practical, but it also created a built-in tension within the empire, something the source points out very clearly. The basic conflict between the needs of the nomadic pastoralists, the Mongol elite, and the settled agriculturalists, the majority of their subjects.
What kind of conflict?
Pastoralists need huge areas of land for their herds to graze. Farmers need their specific fields cultivated and protected. It's easy for grazing animals to damage crops, or for grazing lands to be converted to farmland, or vice versa. Their needs could clash directly.
That must have been a constant headache for the rulers.
It absolutely was, and the source gives a really vivid example of this tension. It quotes a speech by Genghis Khan.
He was the Ilkhanate ruler in Persia you mentioned earlier.
That's him.
Okay.
Ruled from 1295 to 1304. He had converted to Islam and was really trying to govern Persia effectively. And he gave this speech where he basically tells off his Mongol commanders for letting their followers plunder the peasants.
What did he say? It's quite a striking quote.
It really is. He asks them, if you insult the peasantry, take their oxen and seed, and trample their crops into the ground, what will you do in the future?
Wow. That's incredibly direct. He's telling his own Mongol elite to stop wrecking the foundation of the state.
Precisely. He's spelling out the basic economic reality of ruling a settled empire.
Yeah.
Your wealth, your power, ultimately comes from the productivity of the land and the people working it. If you destroy that base through short-sighted plunder or letting herds run wild, you're undermining your own state. That speech is powerful evidence of the shift in thinking required from Mongol rulers as they became governors, not just conquerors. They had to adapt their priorities.
And Genghis Khan converting to Islam himself, that fits into this pattern of adaptation too.
Absolutely. His conversion, like other Mongol rulers in the Western Khanates adopting Islam, or Kublai Khan in China adopting many Chinese imperial ways, it shows the Mongol elite gradually integrating into the dominant cultures of the lands they ruled. The empire wasn't static, it was this dynamic mix where the rulers themselves changed over time.
Okay, so we have the military structure, the administrative pragmatism, the internal tensions. The text also talks about something called the Yasa. That seems important for understanding Mongol identity and how they saw their own rule.
Yes, the Yasa, or sometimes Yasa, it's generally described as a code of law or maybe a set of decrees that's attributed directly back to Genghis Khan himself. It's a fascinating and somewhat mysterious aspect of their rule.
When was it supposed to have been created?
The thinking is it probably originated quite early, maybe even formalized around that big 1206 Kriltai when he became Genghis Khan.
And what was in it? What kind of laws?
It seems to have been a mix of things. It definitely included traditional Mongol tribal customs and unwritten laws, but it also incorporated specific decrees made by Genghis Khan himself, particularly rules for organizing the army, setting up the administration, including the famous YAM, the horse-based postal relay system that kept communications moving across the empire.
That relay system was crucial, wasn't it?
Incredibly important for holding such a vast area together. Now, the source also mentions something interesting about how later writers talked about the Yesa.
What's that?
Some chroniclers apparently suggested the Yasa might have been influenced by, or was comparable to, the laws of figures like Moses or Solomon, revered ancient lawgivers.
Seriously, they compared Genghis Khan to Moses.
Some did. But the source treats this cautiously. It suggests this might have been less about actual historical influence and more about, flattering Genghis Khan. Linking him to these famous figures was a way to boost his legitimacy and importance. But the very fact that they made that comparison tells you how significant the Yasa was perceived to be.
So what was his main job, its main purpose?
It seems to have been multifaceted. On one level, yes, it was about creating order and discipline, setting down rules for behavior, defining duties, enforcing loyalty both among the diverse Mongol groups and across the even more diverse peoples they conquered.
A framework for the whole empire.
Right. Although the source also notes that how the Yasa was interpreted and actually applied could change over time and differ between the various successor Khanates. It wasn't totally set in stone.
And the text suggested it was maybe more than just a list of laws.
Yes, that's a really key insight. The argument is that the Yasa wasn't just a legal code, it functioned almost like an ideology, a shared system of belief for the empire.
An ideology. How so?
Well, think about it. You have this enormous empire stretching across continents full of people speaking different languages, practicing different religions from different ethnic backgrounds. How do you hold that together? The Yasa, being linked directly to the authority and legacy of Genghis Khan, provided a kind of common identity, a shared set of principles that transcended all those differences. It helped create a sense of unity, a Mongol way that was more than just following rules. It was a cultural and political anchor. For its time, creating that kind of unifying framework across such diversity was pretty unique.
That's a really interesting way to think about it, law as identity. Okay, so looking back on the whole Mongol phenomenon now, what's the lasting impression? What's the overall legacy? It's clearly a story with very different sides.
Deeply contradictory, absolutely. On the one hand, you just cannot ignore the sheer scale of the violence and destruction, especially during the initial conquests. Cities destroyed, populations massacred, entire states wiped off the map. That image, the terrifying horde, dominated how people saw the Mongols for centuries, and it was based on real events.
But that's not the whole story. There's the other side.
There is, and it's often summed up by that term, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace.
Right. Once the dust settled from the conquest.
Exactly. Once things stabilized, the simple fact of having this vast area under a single, relatively secure rule created something unprecedented. It created this huge zone for contact and exchange right across Eurasia. The source specifically mentions how the Mongols actively encouraged and protected trade and travel.
We got the Silk Roads running again, basically, and made them safer.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Safer than they had been for a long time in many stretches. And this led to this incredible flourishing of trade, yes, but also cultural exchange, the spread of technologies, ideas, religions, people moving back and forth between East and West. Think Marco Polo, but also diplomats, missionaries, craftsmen.
So information and goods could travel much more easily.
Far more easily and safely than before across that huge landmass. This connectivity, this linking up of worlds, was vital for the empire itself, but it also had huge long-term impacts on the development of societies all across Eurasia long after the Mongol Empire itself fragmented.
So you have to somehow hold both images in your head at the same time, the brutal conqueror and the facilitator of global connection.
You absolutely do. The source really emphasizes that you can't understand the Mongols if you only look at one side. You have to grapple with both the destruction and the connection. Their impact wasn't simple. It was this complex mix of violence, adaptation, and integration. When you consider the sheer size of the empire, the incredible diversity they ruled, the unique ways they adapted things like the Yasa to manage it all, it's a historical event that just doesn't fit into neat boxes.
And this legacy, it's not just ancient history, is it? It still resonates today.
No, it does. The source briefly mentions how Genghis Khan is seen in Mongolia today. After times when his legacy was suppressed or viewed negatively, especially under communism, he's been reclaimed in a huge way.
As a national hero.
Absolutely, a powerful symbol of Mongolian strength, unity, and national identity. It's a really interesting example of how historical figures in the memory of past empires can be reinterpreted and used in the present to shape how a nation sees itself.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, we've looked at that core paradox, nomadic empires. We've talked about the tricky sources and the biases we have to navigate. We followed Temujin's incredible journey to becoming Genghis Khan. We saw the power of the Mongol military, but also what limited it. We've examined how they adapted to govern diverse, settled societies, using local administrators and facing new challenges like the farmer-herder tension. We've discussed the Yasa as both law and kind of unifying ideology. And finally, we've reflected on that complex legacy, the Pax Mongolica versus the initial destruction.
Yeah, and understanding the Mongols, I think it gives us really valuable insights. Insights into different ways empires can be built, maybe ways that don't fit our standard Western models. Insights into how interconnected the world became even back then and the impact of that exchange. And maybe most importantly, it forces us to think critically about history itself, how stories get told, whose perspective we're hearing, and how biases shape our understanding of the past.
It really makes you think about power, connection, and maybe adaptation.
Hinky.
The Mongols showed that, well, you didn't necessarily need stone castles and centuries of bureaucratic tradition to build something vast. Fierce loyalty, incredible adaptability, and this sheer will to connect disparate worlds could do it too. But wow, that connection came at such a brutal cost for so many caught in the path of the conquest.
It did. Or perhaps thinking about those biased sources again, maybe the final question we should leave listeners with is this. Given how much of what we read was written by those who feared or were defeated by the Mongols, how much of that enduring image of the barbarian reflects the complete reality of their rule, and how much reflects the inability or maybe the unwillingness of settled societies to truly understand a different kind of power that emerged from the world beyond their fields and walls? Something to definitely keep thinking about.